welcome to another episode of Seed Speaks. My name is Alex Martin, and today I'm absolutely thrilled to be your host. This week, I'd like to welcome you to our first episode of Season 6 of Seed Speaks. As you saw last week in our commercial, in this season, we're diving into myth-busting the seed industry. So we're here this time to help you correct misconceptions throughout the industry. This week, we're going to tackle the topic of food safety in seed, and it's going to be a really fun topic. We have quite a few different people who are going to help us work through this. So to help us learn more, we have three fantastic panelists joining us. Joe Schwarcz, who is Director of the Office of Science and Society at McGill University, and also the author of Quack Quack, The Treat of Pseudoscience. Joe Pezzini, who is Chairman of the Board of the Center for Produce Safety, and Clinton Monchuk, who is Executive Director for Farm and Food Care Saskatchewan. Joe, Clinton, and Joe, thanks to all of you for joining us today. Before we dive into some questions, I like to do some introductions with our guests. So, Joe Schwarcz, I'm going to start with you, and because we have two Joes today, you're going to be known as Joe S. from here on out. But could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and kind of the research you do at McGill?
My background is chemistry. I have a PhD in chemistry, and I teach chemistry both to chem students and to medical students. And as you mentioned, I also direct the university's Office for Science and Society, which is really a unique venture. And our mandate is to separate sense from nonsense and myth from fact. And as you can imagine, these days, that is quite a challenge because there are a lot of charlatans out there, there are a lot of misinformants, and people don't know whom to listen to. We try to provide some guidance based on evidence. That's really our motto, is we worship at the altar of peer review. Perhaps a bit too fervently, because peer review, of course, is not always everything it is said to be. There are errors that creep into literature as well, but still it's the best tool that we have for separating sense from nonsense. And we deal with all kinds of areas. I mean, food is only one. Cosmetics, medications, the environment, all of the issues that people have questions about, we hope to clarify for them.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Joe S. And Joe Pezzini, hereby known as Joe P., we'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about yourself and the CPS.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks for having me. Appreciate being on the show. I'm Senior Director of Ag Operations for Taylor Farms. I've been in the produce industry ever since I was a kid, growing up on our family farm in California. My intersection with food safety really started in 2006 as a volunteer leader for the local Grower Shipper Association, and that was when the spinach outbreak occurred. And I happened to be the chairman of that organization, so I helped rally the industry, I like to say, and I became the first chairman of the California Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement. And that was an organization that created an auditing program in California, later into Arizona as well, around good agricultural practices, especially for lettuce and leafy greens. Now, the Center for Produce Safety was created in 2007. It was really a cooperative between UC Davis, the California Department of Food and Agriculture, several trade associations in the produce industry, and also some industry advocates. And it's really about funding research for produce food safety. And so in 14 years, we've funded more than 200 research projects, investing more than $40 million in research funds. And these are all around areas of concern around food safety, because at the time of the spinach outbreak, food safety for produce, there wasn't much research. So we really saw a need. And so we dove in there and have created this organization to do that.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Joe. And finally, we're going to leave off with Clinton. Clinton, we'd love to hear a little bit more about you and your work with Farm and Food Care Saskatchewan.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Alex, and thanks for having me on your show. I'm a born and bred farm boy. I come from a small town in Saskatchewan here in Canada. We grew up grain, dairy, beef, and then I got into the poultry industry, and now we have a layer operation, and then also married into a ranching family down in Oklahoma, where we now own part of a certified Black Angus ranch down there. So Farm and Food Care Saskatchewan is a little bit different than most of the organizations that maybe some of you listening are accustomed to. We are 100% generic agriculture. We are specifically in effectively the business to try and make sure consumers have truthful information about their food and where it comes from. So we do a lot of engagement activities, whether it's tours, online activities, like our Canadian Food Focus arm and social media arm, really trying to, Joe Schwarcz does a lot of the science around the misinformation. We're trying to get it into bite-sized pieces of information and making sure that there's engagement with consumers about what truly farmers and ranchers are doing.
Perfect. Thank you so much. This is going to be a great panel with all of that expertise behind us. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So Joe P., I'd love to start with you first. Can you tell us a little bit more about food safety and why it really matters in the long run when we're working with different things from produce to other foods?
I mean, the bottom line is that we're providing healthy food and to protect consumers. And we're in an industry where we're growing, processing, distributing fresh, wholesome produce. But it's really personal because it's the same food that we put on the tables for our families. And it's the same food that our employees take home to put on the tables for their families. And so it really is personal. It doesn't get any closer to the heart than that. And that's why food safety is so important in the produce industry. It really is about providing healthy food.
Perfect. Thanks so much. And Joe S., I know you work at your office in looking into a lot of different areas of agriculture and how it plays into the consumer role. How do you see different areas of agriculture play into food safety, and how do we see agriculture ensuring that food's safe for consumers in the grocery?
Well, of course, agriculture is such a broad area. There's so many issues to consider. What I'm always amazed at is how safe our food supply actually is and how rarely we see these outbreaks. Now, of course, when there is an outbreak, it gets a lot of publicity because, as we know, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And people don't think about the fact that, 99% of the time that they're eating, there's no concern at all about what they're eating. It's totally safe. And when you take into account all of the possible sources of contamination, I mean, from the farm, from animals pooping onto the produce to transport, and, if a truck isn't cleaned properly, what happens in the supermarket, if some attendants may not wash their hands properly, then you prepare the food at home, which, can also introduce problems. And yet most of the time, by far, the majority of the time, there's no problem that arises. And a lot of that is because of the extreme care that is taken. And, today we know quite a bit about how contamination occurs. We know about the dangers of fertilizer runoff, of pesticide runoff, and what to do about it. And there's a great deal of attention being paid to all of the possible sources of contamination. We don't live in a perfect world, and you can never guarantee 100% safety because there are just too many variables that are involved in food production, too many things that come into contact with food. But as I said, to me, it's really quite amazing how rarely things go wrong when you know how complicated the whole food production process is and all of the places where some form of contaminant can enter the food supply, and yet it happens very rarely. And I think that unfortunately, when something happens, when pesticide residues are found on food, it gets blown way out of proportion because people don't think of numbers And very often, the activists will just say that it's there without talking about how much. And of course, we know in science, everything revolves around numbers. It's a question of dose. And it's always annoying when, they just talk about whether or not some contaminant is there without referring to how much there is in comparison to what we know to be toxic. Because, these days our ability to find substances is down to the parts per trillion. That's the width of a credit card in the distance between the Earth and the Moon. It's unbelievable that we can find that, but we can. But just because some contaminant may be there doesn't mean it causes a problem. And the times that it causes a problem are very, very rare. So, I get back to the fact that our food production is very good. I wish that nutrition understanding, equaled it. I think people worry about contaminants in their food and then go and plunge into all the high fat, high sugar, high salt foods, which is a much bigger concern than any contaminant in food production.
Thanks so much. Clinton, you have a really unique perspective here because you're, as you mentioned, you're on the livestock side of food safety. What's kind of some of the differences that you see working with animals versus traditional crops in the realm of food safety?
So, and yeah, you're right. So I've grown up with livestock my entire life. The big thing is the element of perishability, right? So on the food side, there's a element that animal proteins can go bad sooner than, say, plant proteins. The other thing is just the nature of how they're being produced. So I'll give you an example of that. We do have a grain farm, and I finished my harvest a couple of weeks ago up here in Saskatchewan. I can store that stuff in a grain storage bin for, as long as it's dry and low moisture for years, and it's not going to go bad. And I've taken it off fairly clean, and other than just the odd weed here and there, weed in that bin, it's going to stay pure. The problem with animal proteins is you can't store them indefinitely unless there's freezing, and even at freezing, there you do have the ability for things to go or lose quality after a while. So you have to take that into account when you're talking about food safety, that element. The other thing that, and Dr. Schwarcz kind of alluded to this as well, is that animals produce waste, right? So there's manure around. If I look at my egg barn, there is the possibility, and we have a free-run aviary system with our egg barn, there's the possibility of eggs being laid on the ground and being pooped on, right? So once that happens, we can't actually sell that egg into the grocery system. So we have to consume those eggs ourselves, which we do consume some of those ourselves. But that's one of those elements that on the food safety side, there's a few more checks and balances that are in place, and I'll talk about some of them later on in terms of how that works out. But it's a little bit of a different animal, I guess you could say, when it comes to food safety because of some of those factors.
That's fair. I actually had a question, and I might direct this a little bit more to you, Clinton, and then to Joe Pezzini. But what are you hearing in terms of regulations when it comes down to food safety? I mean, Clinton, you're based in Canada. Joe, you're based in the U.S. What do growers and companies need to be aware of in terms of the regulation side? Clinton, I might start with you, and then we'll shoot the answer to you, Joe Pezzini.
So the regulations are always changing, and I'll give you a case in point. So we built a new barn in 2018, I think it was 2017, something like that. By the time we already had 2 flocks in, the regulations have already changed so much on how many birds we could grow in there. So they keep on getting lower and lower to provide more space for these animals. And it has nothing to do with science. The science was back before. It's the influence from consumer demands and thought process. So in getting to Dr. Schwarcz, some of these worries are the perceptions around, say, the animal agriculture industry is we need to humanize it to a certain degree. So as a result of that, the industry has had to change to make sure that we're meeting those consumer needs, which as a farmer, I have limited choices. I have to adapt to that. But at the same extent, I look at the safety of the food, and the safety of the food still remains at that high quality. It's just some of these other demands that are being pushed from consumers to meet their demands. And as a result, it costs me more at the end of the day as well.
Thank you. Joe Pezzini, I'd love to hear your opinion as it relates to produce on the regulation side.
Well, actually, there's quite a bit of regulation now. I mean, that's certainly evolved over the last 15 years or so, but it goes based from the federal level, the produce safety rule, which is all encompassing on all produce, on best practices in growing produce, to state level programs like the California Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement and the Arizona Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement. And those really are looking at best practices, mitigating risk. Clinton was talking about animal production. Certainly there's things that we have to be cognizant of and buffer against, so things aren't compatible to growing produce. And there really is a much higher consciousness of what those risks are. And it goes down to the quality of the water and your source of water. It goes to worker hygiene, adjacent land use. I mean, there's lots and lots of regulation now that govern growing fresh produce, and it is for protecting the consumer. It is about producing the safest produce possible. And, Dr. Schwarcz talked about how really rare it is to have a foodborne outbreak. And that is true. But we also have to say that just one is too many. And that's something as an industry that we have to continue to keep raising the bar on produce food safety. And so there's multiple layers of efforts to do that, including regulation.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Before we move on,
I'm afraid we have a fire here. We have a fire alarm. I have to get out.
No problem, Joe. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you later.
Hopefully it's a false alarm.
Hopefully. See you later, Joe. Thank you so much again.
I was gonna say, hopefully he can leave his screen on so we know if it really is a fire.
We'll put him in the back end of our viewpoint so we can tell and make sure he's okay. But before we move on, then I got in an audience question actually from Ashley Robinson that I think is gonna keep us on the mindset we were just talking about. She wants to know, how much sway do consumers have in food regulations, and should they have that kind of control? Joe, Clinton, I'll leave it up to you. Who wants to answer that first, or who wants to tackle it?
Well, I'll start. I mean, I think ultimately consumers do have control. They're not going to buy product that they don't think is safe. And it is enforced through state, federal, local governments, including industry efforts as well. So I think consumers do have a lot of say in that ultimately. Now, they're not going to be perhaps in the nitty gritty. And I think that's where we advocate for science-based solutions and better knowledge on ensuring and mitigating risk and ensuring food safety. But I think ultimately consumers do have the ultimate say.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Joe. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, sorry. From my perspective, it's kind of interesting because when you go to a grocery store, it should be the given that food is safe. Okay. That when you go to a grocery store in the United States or Canada, I spent time in both countries. That food should be safe. That should be a given for everybody that goes in. Now, that's not necessarily a given for the consumers who are going in. And there's different research done in both countries looking at the level of trust that consumers have with the verification systems that are in place, whether it's the USDA in the US or the CFIA in Canada. And I think that is one of those communication pieces that needs to happen with consumers so they understand that these food recalls recalls that happen, and Joe had mentioned that. If there is a food recall that happens, that's a good thing. That means the system is working. We've detected it. We're pulling that product off the shelf. Now, there is a difference, though, between the regulations in terms of food safety and the regulations around consumer preference. And this is where I tend to have a little bit of an issue. So, for example, we built a new layer barn that is a free-run aviary system. So this means that birds can kind of fly around and flock, and then they lay their eggs in a nest box and eventually go down a conveyor. Now, we built this, put a lot of money into it, and then now realize that the grader who grades our eggs here in the province of Saskatchewan said, you know what? The demand now for this product isn't as high as we once thought, because there's a premium associated with it, because it costs me more money to actually grow those eggs. So now they're saying, well, we're not too sure if we can pay you the premium anymore after you made this investment in your barn. Now, so for me as a farmer, that's a tough pill to swallow, because now the consumer perception or demand around that product has changed, but I've already made that capital investment. So again, as a given, the food safety should be a high priority for everybody in the food industry, but these little regulatory changes, and I see some of them happening in California. There's a new one around hogs that I just read this last week that's being challenged by the Biden administration. It really makes no sense food safety wise. It's a perception and evaluation of the food industry from others.
Thank you so much for that. I think that leads in really well, Clinton, to our next question we have, which I'm watching the time. We have a couple of minutes left, but I'm going to try to cram in as many questions as I can. I would love to hear from both of you. What's the biggest misconception you've heard while working in the food safety realm, since y'all have been both pretty active in it for a long time? Clinton, I might let you start this time, and then I'll let Joe Pezzini take it away right after.
Sure, there's a ton, especially on animal agriculture. A lot goes back to animal welfare, and I'm not going to say that there's sometimes a few bad actors in the industry, but it really comes back to welfare. The thing at the end of the day is that if I don't treat my animals healthy and they're not safe and have a good kind of environment to thrive in, they're not going to do well. If there's animal abuse going on in a barn, they're not going to produce. So it's in nobody's interest to actually not care for our animals at an absolute top priority. So when it comes to animal proteins, again, there was a study done from the Center for Food Integrity here in Canada indicating roughly 2/3 of consumers here in this country don't believe that animals are treated humanely in this country. And for me, that's a tough pill to swallow, because every farmer, rancher that I know, that is the top priority in what we do on our farms and ranches.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Joe Pezzini, I'll let you take it away from now.
So on the produce side, I think the misconception is that food safety is really a holistic approach on the farm, and it goes throughout everything that comes in contact with that produce, from the time the seed is planted in the ground to all the inputs, including water and fertilizer, in anything, including employees that may work on the cultural side or handle the product post-harvest, that this is a holistic approach. And it is employing the best practices to mitigate risk and to eliminate contamination. And so I think that's exactly why we fund the science, because we want to improve our programs. We want to be able to ensure produce is indeed safe, which it is, but we need to continue to elevate our understanding. And so I think that's the approach from the produce side, is to know everything that we're doing. And there are advocacy groups that will challenge when myths are out there or misconceptions, but it is a really holistic approach.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Joe. And welcome back to Joe Schwarcz. So I guess there was no fire, so thanks for joining us.
There was. Yeah, there really was. But they put it out very quickly.
Good. Well, then we'll direct our next question to you, Joe Schwarcz. Thanks again for joining us again. We just talked about some big misconceptions we hear in the realm of food safety. But just in general, what is your recommendation for correcting misinformation in the industry?
As I mentioned earlier, I often get the question of how we know what we know. And the answer to that is that we go by the published literature. And when it comes to pesticides and fertilizers and food additives and bacterial contamination, what we do here to my office is go through the scientific literature and try to clarify what all of this means. It is not really our role to advocate one way or another. For example, when it comes to kind of the debate that we see these days between veganism and eating animals, it's not our role to sway people one way or another. It's to explain. And there are issues. I mean, there certainly are issues with animal agriculture. It has a very large footprint, certainly in terms of fertilizer use, pesticide use, and petrochemical use. So we try to clarify that and then try to guide people towards making appropriate decisions. But I also certainly take up the battle with the misinformants. And there are many like that out there. And they have various agendas. Usually, you follow the money. I mean, that's the rule. And especially with COVID, we've just seen so much of this. I mean, we have unfortunately people like Joe Mercola in the U.S. with huge followings. He's a former osteopath, but he's got an unbelievable following. And the New York Times has declared him to be the most significant misinformant in the country. And yet, I get lots of questions, and I know that these questions are coming from listening to people like that. And they can be very convincing. And, that's one thing I have to give begrudging credit to the misinformants. They're very good at what they do. They're very good at basically taking information that is scientific and twisting it to their own ends. What we try to do is to untwist it. So, that's all I can tell you. It's not an easy business to try to battle the misinformation, because, when you're being very, very selective and you take things out of context, you can make them very appealing to the public. And unfortunately, most people do not have enough of a scientific background to separate the wheat from the chaff, as it were. We try to do that for them, but it is a very tough task to battle the misinformation, because it can be extremely seductive.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Joe. I'm going to try to get in one last question before the end of the day. And it's just, I think this one's going to be a little bit more geared towards Joe Pezzini and to Clinton again. But if an outbreak does happen, if a food safety outbreak does happen, which we've identified doesn't happen very often, what is your suggestion for getting ahead of the game communication-wise?
I don't know who you're directing that to first, but I'll go. I mean, it is about an immediate and effective traceback, right? So, and Clinton alluded to this earlier, is you got to remove the product, but then it goes beyond that. It is about doing a thorough investigation, and it's always very frustrating when there are a situation where we don't get conclusive results, but doing a root cause analysis to really understand what happened, so we can improve our practices if they need to be changed, and that's what we're all looking for.
I was going to say, from my perspective, it's once it's out there, you're trying to recall that and get it off. But I even want to go further back, and I look at the egg industry, and we do salmonella swab testing, not only on our eggs, but on the walls of our barn, on our egg belts, to make sure that when we place those birds in the barn, that barn is pristine and clean. So that the only way that we could get salmonella into the barn, into that egg system, is from an outside source, which means then we have biosecurity to protect that. So I'm all about preventing it right before it can even happen.
Perfect. Thanks so much to all of you. I know there were so many more questions I wanted to ask you all today, but that is unfortunately all the time we have today in our panel. So thank you to all three of you. I know I've definitely learned something a little bit more about food safety. Hopefully everyone in our audience took home a fun fact today as well. But if you liked this topic, make sure to tune in next week. My coworker, Allie Roden, will be talking about myth busting and combating misconceptions within the organic seed sector. So that should be a really fun discussion. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you then.